Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this lecture of Software Requirements Engineering, and in today's lecture we are going to finalize our discussion on the topic of software, specifically the elicitation process within the Software Requirements Engineering process. But before we go ahead and start our today's lecture, let me just quickly recap as what we have done in our previous lecture. We again continued our discussion because we have been discussing for past 2-3 lectures different elicitation techniques, and we continued our discussion on those. Because one of the biggest problems and one of the biggest hurdles in requirements engineering is eliciting requirements and talking to your clients and breaking the ice and involving different stakeholders, because you want to know everything that you have to do within the system, everything useful which you can do within the system within the limited resources as well that you have. So a few other techniques that we discussed in our previous lecture, it included document studies, questionnaires, brainstorming, focus groups, collaborative requirement gathering, and quality function deployment. Document studies, we said that you have lots of different documents available to you, you read them, you gain some knowledge from them, and based on whatever you have acquired, you try to list down some requirements. Similarly, you can also use questionnaires, and there are different purposes of questionnaires. You can use questionnaires to get an opinion about something. You can also use a questionnaire to test your hypothesis or test your assumptions as well. Similarly, you can conduct brainstorming sessions, and brainstorming sessions are all about where you ask people to sit around in a big room and you share a problem with them, and you ask people to let's think, like what do you think would be a solution to this problem, or what are the problems with this particular process, and these kind of things. But important thing in brainstorming is, which we mentioned in our lecture as well, that you should not be critical about any idea presented by any of the participants, because if you become critical, then then the participants, they may not be very open and they may not want to share their ideas because they think it's a stupid idea. So no idea is stupid or bad when you have these brainstorming sessions. Then another similar technique that we discussed was focus groups, and in focus groups we said that the main comparison between brainstorming and focus groups are that they are more formal. Normally an agenda is shared with all the participants before, and it's a phased approach. The focus group technique, it's phased. In the initial phase, the participants, they share the problems, and then they suggest what according to them is the best solution. Then they try to give the rationale of the best solution, that why do they think that this is the best way to solve this particular problem. But one thing important for you to know as a facilitator in those sessions is that these participants should get the feeling that they are taking something back in return from those focus group meetings. Otherwise, in the next meeting, they won't share too much information because they want solutions to their problems. So you should be very participative, and you should be suggesting them that, okay, this is the way we can do it. And so the idea is that you involve lots of people, and they share their problems with you and they share their solutions with you. But in the end, you should kind of summarize it and give them something back, so that they can be satisfied that, okay, our problems are listened to, and we have a solution, or we have agreed upon a solution which would be there in the final product. Then another technique which we talked about was collaborative requirement gathering, and you can think of these brainstorming and focus groups as sub techniques or kind of within the same group of collaborative requirement gathering, because collaborative requirement gathering is nothing is not that different. What we do in collaborative requirement gathering session is again very similar to these two techniques, because we have people sitting together, and we have a facilitator who is conducting the meeting. We have a recording mechanism where we record everything that all the participants are suggesting. And the good thing about all these collaborative requirement gathering techniques, for example brainstorming, focus groups, because that you have different people sitting together, and if there are any conflicts or any inconsistencies, then you can as a facilitator, you can identify them and you can resolve those issues at the spot. So that is the beauty of using these techniques, where you have lots of stakeholders sitting together and sharing their ideas. Then another technique that we discussed was quality function deployment, and as I told you guys, that this is a technique which is very frequently used in engineering discipline, but we can also use it in software requirements engineering. And it's a very interesting technique because on the one hand it models the customer wishes, and on the other hand it models the technical features that the client wants in the product, and then it tries to identify that which of those technical features are conflicting with which customer wishes, and then you kind of prioritize those wishes and those technical features based on the competitor analysis, and so that you can prioritize which requirement is more desirable to the client and which is kind of more required for the product to be successful, so that you can focus your attention more on that and lesser on the other one. So those were the techniques that we discussed in our previous lecture, and towards the end of the lecture we started talking about that during the elicitation phase we also need to analyze our requirements. And if you guys remember, in our first lecture on elicitation process we said that there is an analysis check which you conduct as a requirement analyst on the requirements that you have gathered, because when we are gathering requirements we gather lots of problematical requirements, and those problematical requirements include inconsistent requirements, incomplete requirements, or unnecessary requirements. So in our analysis within this elicitation process, what we do is we identify these requirements, and once we have identified these requirements we prioritize that which issues are more important, which needs resolution before the others. So we take them back to the client, and in today's lecture we are going to start our discussion with negotiation, that how do we negotiate with the client? How do we negotiate with the client that these were the problems that were identified in the requirements that we have elicited? So how do you want to resolve them? Or there is an inconsistency in these two requirements, they are conflicting with each other, so which one is right and how do we go about it? So let's see, in today's lecture we'll start our discussion with negotiation, and then we'll, as I promised you guys in my previous lecture today, I will also share some state-of-the-art techniques which different researchers have proposed in recent years, that how to elicit requirements. We are going to have a quick look on that, and then we'll summarize the overall this topic of requirements elicitation. So what is requirements negotiation? Disagreement about requirements are inevitable. When a system has many stakeholders, conflicts are not failures but reflect different stakeholders' needs and priorities. So it is inevitable that, for example, if I ask a couple of people that what should be the color of this wall, and different people would suggest different colors, because and this is not a problem as such, that why different people are suggesting different colors, but it's just that they think that this color would suit better. So it's not a problem. It's just you need to, different stakeholders might have different needs and might have different priorities. Now it's when you identify these conflicts, it is important to identify these conflicts, because some stakeholders are more equal than other, because they would have more say in what should be done in the end product. So you need to identify those conflicts, and you need to say, okay, this requirement was given by this stakeholder and this was given by this stakeholder. If both of them are at the same level, then maybe you have a common session with those stakeholders and ask them that how do you want to go about it, because these two things cannot be done at the same time. So it's not a problem. It's just that different people might think, might have different needs or might have different priorities. Requirements negotiation is the process of discussing these conflicts and reaching a compromise that all stakeholders can agree to. So this is important to understand, that we have to satisfy all the clients. So we cannot build a system for all the users where some users are not happy with the system and the others are really happy about it. So negotiation is all about taking everybody on board and taking all the stakeholders on board. So we need to satisfy all the clients. So we might not be doing something which one of the stakeholders wanted, but we need to make sure that he's also happy or he's also satisfied that the way we are doing it or the way other stakeholders said it, it will also resolve his problem. So we need to make sure of that all the stakeholders, they agree to it. In planning a requirements engineering process, it is important to leave enough time for negotiation. Finding an acceptable compromise can be time consuming. Negotiation is a very slow process. At times, because you have identified that Mr. A said one requirement and Mr. B said this same requirement in a different fashion. So these two guys, for example, we have these two people and both of them has, said this particular requirement, which is related to, for example, course registration. Now, he has given his version and Mr. B has given his version of registration. Now, both of these requirements, let's say they have conflicts in them, but both of them, they are related to the registration process of the course registration process in our LMS system. Now, what might happen is that why negotiation takes a lot of time is because you know that these requirements, for example, RB was given by resource B and RA was given by resource A. Now these two requirements, RA and RB, they are conflicting. Now we have identified that there is a conflict in these two requirements, and we need to talk to these two people. So number one, the problem can be that, you know, these stakeholders, they don't give you time to actually talk to, but when they give you time, then they are not free at the same time slot, because you want to discuss it with both of them, or you want to discuss this with their boss or whatever. So negotiation is actually a slow process, and when they all the people are on the table, then it is very difficult to satisfy both these people. So as a requirement analyst, you should actually foresee that this problem is going to occur, and there are always conflicts. As we have said, that conflicts are inevitable when you do requirements elicitation. So you need to give yourself enough time towards the end of the requirements engineering elicitation process, that you are able to negotiate the requirements, or you are able to satisfy all the stakeholders that these are the final set of requirements, and what we have is going to give is ensuring a solution for all your problems. And it might seem that, you know, what you are suggesting, we're not doing it, but we're doing it in a different way. So you need to actually satisfy all the clients. At the same time, you need to resolve the conflicts as well. So that's why it's a very difficult process. It's very time consuming, and it's an art. So some people are really good at negotiation, whereas others are not. So you can learn some negotiation techniques, but still, you know, it's an innate ability. Some people would be better than others when negotiating different things. So now how do you conduct these negotiation meetings? As I said, you need to conduct a meeting between all those stakeholders, you know, who have identified those conflicting requirements, or who have told you those conflicting requirements. An information stage where the nature of the problem associated with the requirement is explained. First one is the information stage, where you basically, all the people are sitting together, and the requirement analyst would show and say, okay, you know, this is the nature of the problem, and according to my analysis, I've identified that, you know, these two requirements, they cannot be done at the same time, or, you know, this would mean that this process is not consistent. So a discussion stage, next stage is the discussion stage, where the stakeholders involved discuss how these problems might be resolved. All stakeholders with an interest in the requirement should be given the opportunity to comment. Priorities may be assigned to requirements at this stage. So again, as I said, that all the stakeholders, they should be there, who were responsible for telling you these requirements, and they should be given time to comment on, you know, why did they think that this thing should be done in this particular fashion. Moreover, the priorities, requirement prioritization can be done at this stage, because you can give priorities to requirements which you think which are more important for this particular process. And then the final stage is the resolution stage, following the discussion stage, where actions concerning the requirements are agreed. So what are these actions? These actions might be to delete the requirements, to suggest specific modifications to the requirement, or to elicit further information about the requirement. So there are three possibilities that you can do. Number one is that you can delete the requirement. So you say that, okay, no, this is conflicting, so let's get rid of this, and we can do without it. The second solution is that you say, okay, no, if we change this requirement in this particular fashion, then it satisfies Mr. A's need and Mr. B's priorities as well. So both of them are happy, and, you know, you have a consistent requirement as well. And then the final solution is that okay, you say, okay, you have not been able to resolve the conflict. You have not been able to resolve the conflict with slight modifications, and you think that this is not a requirement which you delete and you can get away with it. So you say, okay, what we would do is we'll do further elicitation. We'll conduct a more focused interview with this client, with these client, and we'll do a brainstorming session, let's say. So there are multiple, all the techniques that we have discussed, you can use any one of them to which you think is more focused, because now you have identified a very small problem, which is this conflicting requirement, and you want to gain more deeper understanding of this process. So you will do further elicitation, and in this elicitation you can also go and look at similar systems, or look at the competitor's product, that how did they resolve this particular scenario, or how did they come to the solution to this particular problem. So these are the three options at the resolution stage: either you delete the requirement, or you modify it, or you do further elicitation. So this is what negotiation is about, that we want to satisfy all the clients. So we have these three stages: information stage, then the discussion stage, and the resolution stage. We are going to have a further discussion on the negotiation process, and because it is a sub-process of the overall requirements engineering process. And when we do that, we are going to talk about requirements prioritization in detail, and we are going to discuss various prioritization techniques which are present in literature. So, so as a requirement analyst, as a guy who is responsible for eliciting requirements, you should know that negotiation is also done within this elicitation process, because elicitation would result in conflicting requirements. And as an analyst, what you should be able to do is to identify those conflicts, and you need to inform different stakeholders, then you need to discuss with those stakeholders, and then you need to resolve as a good negotiator, as a good requirements analyst. So this is as far as we are going to discuss negotiation within the elicitation process. Now let's look at some state-of-the-art techniques which have been proposed by different researchers on requirements elicitation. Now this first technique, Wiki-based stakeholder participation in requirements engineering, it is proposed by Decker et al. And what they propose is that they use wikis as a platform for asynchronous collaboration of multiple stakeholders to elicit software requirements. So what they are suggesting is that you can use wikis, and you can have lots of different stakeholders, and they can suggest what they feel about the solution on that platform. What they claim is that by doing so, it will enable, or it will involve more stakeholders. Because one of the key problems with requirements elicitation is the stakeholder involvement. So according to them, this approach would result in greater participation of the stakeholders. And their whole approach, it relies on a moderator, and moderators have multiple jobs to do. He provides information about the requirements topics, specifies content template, and allocate requirements to stakeholders. Now, for example, again, let's discuss our solution, our problem of learning management system for a university. Now, there are different requirements topics for which the requirements needs to be elicited by different stakeholders. Now, for example, one is the registration process. Then you have this examination process. Then you have this lecture process. Then you have faculty profile requirements, and all these kind of things. And what a moderator would do is that using these wikis, he would identify those different topics for which requirements needs to be elicited. Then he would have different stakeholder groups, and he would allocate those different topics to different stakeholder groups. For example, on the registration process, you want input from the faculty members, you want input maybe from administrators, you want input maybe from the students. So you would allow all these three kind of stakeholders to publish or to post requirements on this particular topic. So the good thing about this particular idea or this particular research is that because it's using wiki, so you're not restricting the stakeholders. Because for example, when you conduct an interview, or when you conduct a focus group, or when you have a brainstorming session, or you do collaborative requirement gathering, or any other elicitation technique, what you are doing is that you basically ask a stakeholder to be present at a specified time. He may not be ready for it, or he may not be in a mood to share what he wants to share. But what is the beauty of this technique is that you have people who are sitting, who are doing whatever they are doing, and they are actually working, and they identify, okay, no, this is the problem. So they go to this wiki page, and they go to this tool, and they say, okay, this is what I think is the problem with this particular process. And then other stakeholders are also part of this whole who are also responsible for this particular requirement topic. They can come and they can comment on what the other stakeholders suggested. So it's kind of, if you look at it in more detail, then this is very similar to a collaborative requirement gathering technique, because you have different stakeholders, you have a moderator, you have a recording mechanism, but it is just using, or it is by using wikis, it has enabled different stakeholders to communicate with each other in an asynchronous fashion, and they have the liberty of suggesting requirements at will. So you're not actually forcing them to elicit requirements from 10 to 12 on a Thursday morning or whatever. So they have their freedom as well. And at times people feel good about it, that you are not forcing them, and they are doing something when they actually want to do it. So the next technique we're going to look at is IRequire. It is proposed by Seth et al. What they have done, they have presented a framework for increasing end users' involvement in the process of requirements elicitation. Again, what you would see in all these different techniques is that they actually all of them, they claim that they have increased the end user involvement, or they have increased the stakeholder involvement. So and this is one of the biggest problem. Once you guys finish your degrees and get in the fields and become requirement analyst or software engineers, and you go and you talk to people, you would realize that it is very difficult to identify the key people. And it is once you have identified the key people, those key people, they don't want to talk to you. And and some of them might talk to you, but some of them they might not talk to you. And the people who actually decide that they're going to talk to you, they don't have enough time. So stakeholder involvement and getting something out of them is the most difficult challenge. So all of these techniques, they claim to some extent that they have increased the end user involvement. Now, how do IRequire does it? Because they use a mobile tool. So their approach, it uses a mobile tool which enables all the end users to blog their needs, and the approach recommends on the site blogging. In the first step, it's a three-step approach. In the first step, what the end users do, the end user is required to register information about his or her environment. So first of all, the end user, he needs to register information that, okay, I am working on this particular process, so this is my environment. In the second step, the end user is required to blog their needs and requirements precisely. The third step finally requires the end user to justify why a need is important by describing the reasons why the need should be deemed important. Now it's a stepwise process of eliciting requirements by different stakeholders. And what is different between IRequire? Now, if you look at it very closely, then if you look at IRequire very closely, then what you would identify that this is actually very similar to maybe a focus group. The difference between this and focus group might be that the focus group have multiple stakeholders sitting together, and then they are sharing requirements. But the portion where we say that the focus group is a staged technique, where in the first phase you basically identify your problem, and then you propose a solution, and then you give rationale of that solution. So what's happening here, that in the first step, the end user is required to register information about his or her environment. So basically the end user is saying, okay, this is the way I deal with this process. So an analyst would later on be able to know that where the end user was coming from. And in the second step, the end user, he basically blogs the need or the problem or the requirements very precisely, and then in the final step, he tries to give a rationale, and he tries to suggest to requirement analysts that, okay, why this is a problem, or why this thing needs to be resolved. Now, the end user involvement is increased because people have this tool or this mobile tool installed on their mobile phones, and whenever they are working, so they have their mobile phones, and using their mobile phone, they can blog whatever they want to blog. So they have registered their environment, and they identify, okay, that this is a new problem. So they open their mobile application, and they say, okay, this is a new problem. Now what IRequire supports, it basically supports different media types. So you can do voice recordings, you can record videos, you can take images, you can send text. So basically it's through this mobile application, this IRequire approach, it enables the stakeholders to record requirements on the move. So that's why it and it enables them to, so they don't actually have to come back on their workstation and log on to a website and then say, okay, this is the problem that I'm facing with my process. So they can do it through their phones. So that's one of the ways that they have increased the end user participation. And the other beauty of this mobile tool is that it allows different kind of media types. So for example, you can take an image. If there is something wrong, you can record a voice message, you can record a video and post it or blog it. So this is another technique by Seth et al., which is IRequire, and they claim that they have increased the end user participation, and they've done it through this approach. Basically is supported by a mobile tool which enables different kinds of media types which end users blog. So the next requirement as elicitation technique we are going to look at is Atena. This is by Laporte et al., and what they have done, they have presented a collaborative approach for eliciting informal stories from end users. So And what they do with those informal stories is that it comprises of a model, a method of group storytelling, and finally a web-based tool. So it's basically what they have done is they have created a web-based tool, and you have lots of different stakeholders who are maybe located in different locations. So it is not feasible for you to conduct a collaborative requirement gathering session, or it is not feasible for you to conduct a focus group session. So what you can do is you can ask all those people to sit together or log on to their Atena tool, and they can start expressing themselves, or they can start expressing a particular scenario. And so it will be a group session where lots of different people are suggesting, or lots of different people are telling, explaining a particular scenario. Now, how does it actually work? In the first phase, the stakeholders will narrate stories on how they use the current system. Then these stories, they are refined by into scenarios by the facilitator. So again, if you guys look at this, then this is a perfect collaborative requirement gathering technique, which is being just modified and implemented as a web tool. Now you have different stakeholders who are narrating stories, and what the facilitator is doing, he is basically recording those stories and analyzing them and converting them into scenarios. And then what is done with those scenarios are converted into use cases. So if you look at it, then multiple techniques have been deployed here. If you guys remember, then observation and social analysis, then what a requirement analyst's job was to observe people at work and take notes. And then towards the end of the session, what the ethnographer used to do was to draw his understanding of the process, and then he used to share it with the people who are outside the process. So here again, the facilitator, what he is doing is understanding the scenarios which have been explained by different stakeholders, and through his understanding, he is creating a scenario, and those scenarios are then converted into use cases by system analyst. So there are two kinds of people involved, from maybe the organization who are developing the software, a requirement analyst, the facilitator, and another analyst who is actually converting those scenarios into use cases. As we have said, that this Atena tool is a web-based application that implements their proposed method and provides an interface that enables the stakeholders to work collaboratively. So it's a combination of multiple techniques, and as I said, that the techniques that we have covered in our lectures of elicitation, different techniques that we have covered, these are the basics of elicitation. And if we have so far, we have seen 3 different techniques, and you can see that all the techniques that we have covered, one way or the other, these techniques actually use them. So the basics are there, and then they are actually making them more usable for the stakeholders, and all they are trying to do is increase stakeholder or end user involvement in an efficient manner. So that is another technique that we have covered, Atena. Then the next one we are going to look at is context. Vermaker et al. Have presented a method to gather end users' need through a geographically deployed feedback system. So this is interesting, that you have this geographical location of different end users, and based on their geographical locations, maybe their needs are different. And so on the basis of that, they are trying to gather requirements. So their method is supported by a smartphone-based application that lets users submit their context-specific feedback of a software system or subsystem. So now, because it's a geographic based as well, so the context is also important, and again, it is supported by a mobile application. So you can see that with the advent of these smartphones, and with so many smartphone applications around, then researchers are also using them to solve or to propose different solutions to different problems, and you can see that a couple of these techniques, they use these mobile phone applications, and by doing so, they are saying that the mobile phone application will enable them or will increase. Mobile phone applications will help this particular technique in 2 ways. Number one, that you get the geographic location as well from the mobile phone, maybe from the GPS coordinates, and through this mobile phone, because if somebody is roaming around, then he can actually record requirements on the move, as was the case with IRequire. So how this feedback is used from different stakeholders, the feedback that stakeholders provide is used to identify problems and weaknesses, so the software intensive systems can be improved and evolved. Now, one thing which is slightly different between this contexter and IRequire is that, if you guys remember, that IRequire said that it's a stepwise process. In the first step, user needs to register his environment. So that was also, the user was registering his context. Now in this particular technique, the feedback can be only given on predefined entities. So for example, a ticket machine, a train station, etc., against which a feedback can be submitted. So whoever is the moderator or whoever is actually managing these entities, an entity needs to be created beforehand, and only on the basis of that entity a feedback can be given. So if an entity is not there, no feedback can be recorded against it. So the entities become available in the mobile application according to the user's context information. So for example, I am near a train station and my organization has deployed the software there. So when I reach that point, then my context is I'm near the train station. My GPS coordinates tell the application that I'm there. So on my interface, I will know, okay, that this is the system that I have deployed. Are there any problems with it? So these entities, they become visible to the end user once they are geographically near to them. So how can the context information be gathered? It can be the GPS coordinates, it can be MAC address or visited website, etc. So the service provider can control which entities to present for feedback. So basically the service provider, or as I said, the moderator or facilitator, he can actually control that which entities you want to actually show to the end user for feedback. Again, this feedback is sent automatically. It is essentially textual with the option to attach multimedia elements. Again, because it's a smartphone application supported technique, you can attach multiple media types. For example, you can attach a photo, you can attach a video, or you can attach a voice clip as well. So again, if you look at this contexter, and if you it is kind of similar to IRequire, because it also supports this technique is supported by a mobile application which allows different kind of media types to be sent to the requirement analyst. And again, if you remember in IRequire we said that an end user needs to register his environment, whereas in Contexter the environment is automatically kind of registered for the end user, because based on his MAC address or his GPS coordinates, the facilitator or the service provider would decide that which entities would be visible to the end user against which he or she can provide the feedback. So this is another way of recording requirements, and then there are certain benefits of it because it increases the end user involvements. And again, end users are not restricted to sit in an environment where they are not near the context and they have to tell about the context. So they are actually there using a particular system, and at the spot they can identify a problem and then they can record that problem. So another technique, and again it is a combination of multiple requirement elicitation techniques that we have covered. Next one is visual requirement specification through Annotate Pro. Rashid et al. Have claimed that end users cannot always articulate their needs and requirements using textual methods. So these researchers, they claim that text is not a very suitable source for expressing requirements for the end users. So what they propose is that end users, they specify requirements visually through mechanisms built into their day-to-day working processes. So what they suggest is that you build some visual mechanism for the end users in their day-to-day work, and it is going to enable the end users to visually chalk out their thoughts and deliver them to a web-based collaboration system. So because you have already incorporated those visual mechanisms in the end user's environment, so what it would enable them to do is, if they have identified a problem, then they can actually draw it visually and explain it in a better fashion, maybe to the requirement analyst. The working principle that they have laid down is that the end users and the requirement analyst will work collaboratively. So they are going to work together when they are making this visual representation of requirements. End users, what they will do, they will sketch out the requirements, and analysts will analyze the significance of each submitted requirements. So again, end user is visually drawing what he thinks is the problem or what he thinks should be in the end product, and then analyst is actually analyzing whatever the end user has provided it and establishing the significance of each requirement that has been submitted. So another technique, and it's different from the other techniques because it says that the textually requirements cannot be expressed by the end user. So another mechanism, which is the visual representation, and this representation can be anything. It can be a use case diagram, but that would be visual again. So for example, you inform your users that this is the use case diagram, and you are an actor, and these are the different things that you are doing, and each and what you should do is you should record each interaction that you have with the system. And so maybe if we incorporate that into day-to-day processes of the end user, then maybe when we are eliciting requirements, then end users can draw different use case diagrams and give it to the requirement analyst, who can analyze and establish the significance of the use cases that have been submitted by the end user. And it is based on this Annotate Pro, this particular technique of visual requirement specifications. So the next technique is StakeRare, which is a stakeholder and recommender assisted method for requirements elicitation. This technique, it has been proposed by Lim et al. And what they propose is that this method, StakeRare, it is aimed at prioritizing and identifying requirements in large-scale software projects. So what the authors believe is that normally there are certain problems with large-scale software system, and these problems are that inadequate stakeholder input, information overload, and biased prioritization of requirements. Now all these three problems, they are interlinked, because we are talking about very large software systems, and when we talk about large software system, then it would mean that there are lots of stakeholders, or there are lots of end users. And so the first problem, that inadequate stakeholder input, means that because there are so many stakeholders involved, so you have not been able to take input from all those stakeholders. So, and you have not been able to talk to maybe the key people that you should have talked to. So you have not identified properly who are the stakeholders, so inadequate stakeholder input would be the result. So that is one of the problems with large-scale softwares that these authors identify, and that they claim that the StakeRare method is a solution to these problems. The second problem is information overload. Now the second problem can be that you have identified all those stakeholders, but there were so many stakeholders, or there were so many key stakeholders identified by you, and they have informed you about so many things that there is information overload. And it is very difficult for you to actually identify, which information is actually useful, or which information should be prioritized, and which information is not necessary. So the third problem is related to this prioritization. That when you prioritize requirements, then again you are not talking to a lot of people, and the prioritization that you're doing is based on some input from some stakeholders, so which can be biased in the end. So these are the main three problems that, according to them, are faced by requirement analysts when they are eliciting requirements for large software, that you have inadequate stakeholder input, you get information overload, and when you are prioritizing requirements, then that is biased. So what they do is that they suggest and they use this social network analysis techniques to identify stakeholders and ask them to recommend other stakeholders. So what they do is that they use this social network analysis technique, and they say that, okay, they identify some stakeholders, and then they ask them to identify more stakeholders. So for example, I am an end user, you come to me and say, okay, I've identified, do you identify me? And you say, okay, what are the people you identify who are key to this process? So then I will point out maybe 2-3 people. So so what they then start doing is that they start building this social network, where each stakeholder is a node. So for example, I am a node, and then I have identified 3 more nodes. So maybe there would be 3 outgoing edges from me who would be representing the 3 stakeholders which I have identified. And then you basically go and talk to all those 3 people, and then you say, okay, can you identify more stakeholders? And then in this fashion you start building a social network. So, and as I said, that they build a social network with nodes representing stakeholders and links representing their recommendations. So all the 3 links which are my recommendations, and prioritizes stakeholders based on their social relationships. So for example, one recommendation might be stronger than the other one. So one, this particular recommendation is stronger. So that is because I'm socially more linked with that particular person. So then they try to prioritize different stakeholders as well. And each stakeholder is required to rate an initial list of requirements. So each stakeholder, for example, I was the stakeholder, so I would rate my initial set of requirements, that which are the things which basically I want. And this list is again then used. This list is used to identify similar stakeholders, and from the requirements provided by these similar stakeholders, it predicts relevant requirements to the stakeholder, who can approve the predicted requirements to add to his or her rating. So what we are doing is that we are asking each stakeholder to rate some initial set of requirements, and then based on those requirements we are identifying more stakeholders, and but now we have lots of different requirements. So we predict for each stakeholder, we predict that these are the requirements which he or she would like to rate, and then what each stakeholder would do is then he would basically select that from those prediction which are the requirements which he or she wants to rate. So this is actually dealing with the first problem, which was inadequate stakeholder input. Then the second problem was information overload, and how the StakeRare method deals with that. To rid the requirement engineer information overload, StakeRare prioritizes stakeholders and their requirements. So through this rating process, and when we are building that social network, we are prioritizing stakeholders. So we already know that which stakeholders are more important and which requirements are more important. So by doing so, let's say through this social network technique, we build a very big social network, and we have identified, I don't know, 1,000 set of 1,000 requirements. And but we know that from those 1,000 requirements, who are my prioritized stakeholders, and from those set of prioritized stakeholders, what are the requirements that those stakeholders with high priority they have identified. So I will basically maybe get a shorter list of requirements from those 1,000 requirements that have been elicited initially using StakeRare. And then the third problem, which was biased requirement prioritization. What StakeRare does, it considers each stakeholder's rating and their influence in the project and produces a prioritized list of requirements. So the requirement prioritization is not only based on the priority given to those requirements by high priority stakeholders, but the requirement priorities, they are basically assigned by all the stakeholders which we have identified through that social network. So basically, it will not happen that, for example, if there are three people who there are three people and one resource is a very high priority. So for example, what is going to happen here is that let's say this is the first stakeholder, and he recommended these stakeholders. Now he has his list of requirements, and based on this list you identify more stakeholders, and he has his list of requirements. Then each stakeholder has his priorities of requirements. Now what is going to happen is that, number one is that you build this social network and you identify lots of stakeholders. So this addressing the first problem of inadequate stakeholder input. Now the second problem was information overload, and now how you are dealing with that information overload is that you are identifying, you know the priorities of the stakeholders. So you basically say, okay, these two people, they have higher priority, so we are going to look at the requirements that they have that they have elicited. So we'll get those requirements, and the next thing is that the requirements which are being prioritized by these people, they are not only prioritized by these two stakeholders, but the priorities would also be assigned by the other stakeholders which are involved in this overall process of elicitation. So it deals with the third problem as well, which is biased requirement prioritization. So again, this technique, StakeRare, it's kind of very interesting, and because it deploys another domain, which is the social network analysis, and it builds a social network to identify stakeholders. And as you guys remember that in our elicitation process, one of the key things, or one of the key activities that we do, is stakeholder analysis. And as I emphasized on our lecture, that if you do not identify stakeholders properly, then it means that you are going to miss on some key information. And when we are building large software, we have a huge amount of stakeholders, and those stakeholders, they might be distributed in different locations. For example, you are deploying an ERP system for a manufacturing concern, and then they might have multiple factories, and they might have multiple warehouses in different locations, and it is very difficult for all the key people to be present in one location. So how do you deal with that problem, and how do you know that, because you are only in one location, how do you know that there are other people who also know about these processes? So maybe for large software you need a different technique. So this is a very interesting and very innovative technique to identify key stakeholders and also deal with other problems of biased requirement prioritization and information overload. So these are the few techniques which I thought was necessary, because I wanted to share this information with you because, for two reasons. Number one is that if you guys look at this lecture again, and if you look at these techniques again, and I have given the references of all these papers in each slide, that if you go through these papers in detail, then what you would realize is that basis of requirement elicitation, it doesn't change. And you have those elicitation techniques which have been there for ages. For example, the interviews, the questionnaires, the collaborative requirement gathering techniques, requirements reuse, and all those techniques, they have been there for a number of years. And what the researchers are doing these days is that they are deploying information from other research areas. And for example, they are using mobile phone applications. What they are trying to do is they are trying to involve more end users, and they are trying to address different problems faced by requirement analysts in the elicitation process. And their proposed techniques, they are a combination of the different techniques that we have discussed. And this is one thing which I said which I emphasized on in my previous lecture, that none of these elicitation techniques are mutually exclusive. In fact, if these techniques are used together with each other, then they complement each other, and they will help a requirement analyst in conducting an elicitation process in a very good fashion if you use these things together. So the one reason was that I wanted you to know that the basis of requirement elicitation technique, it's the same, and the other reason was I wanted you to know that there is lots of possibilities of research as well in this area of requirement elicitation, and it's a huge area on its own within requirements engineering process, requirement elicitation process. It's a huge area. So you can solve different problems related to stakeholders analysis. You can solve different problems related to how to negotiate requirements, how to prioritize requirements, how to analyze requirements. So there are different things that can be done, and we have focused on only different techniques which have been proposed by researchers on requirement elicitation. And there are many more techniques, but these are the few that I thought I should be sharing with you. Now, as we are finishing our topic on requirement elicitation process today, so I thought it is a good idea to have a recap of what we have discussed in the requirements elicitation process. So I thought I should start with this particular image of the requirement elicitation process. Now, what we discussed in this was that elicitation process is a staged activity. So we can say that there are different stages of the elicitation process. Number one, the first stage is that we establish the objectives. Then we try to understand the background. Okay, we try to understand that what is the application domain, and then because we have gathered some knowledge, we try to organize that knowledge. Okay, why we need this organization? Because the final stage is collecting requirements from the stakeholders. So we need to prepare ourselves before we go and talk to stakeholders to elicit requirements. So we organize our knowledge, and in the final stage we collect requirements. Now if we look at all of these stages, then when we are establishing objectives, what we are doing is we are understanding these business goals. We are trying to identify what are the main problems that the end user wants to be solved. We are identifying what are the constraints under which the system would operate, or what are the constraints to the different processes which are involved in this particular system. And when we are done with that, then we try to gain our understanding about the application domain or about the background, and we try to understand the organizational structure. We understand, or we try to develop an understanding of the application domain. For example, we gave the example of railway signaling system. Now, if you are a software guy and you have been working on ERP system all your life, and suddenly you get a project of railway signaling system, then you need to get an understanding of this particular application domain. You need to go and on the site and see how these signals they operate, and what are the specifications of the tracks, and all these kind of things. So you need to gain a very good understanding about the background, which includes the application domain, and you look at existing systems, how they work, what are the flaws with existing systems, and how do people operate these systems. Now you have lots of information at this stage. So at these two stages, you have your understanding about the application domain, you have your understanding about the background, you have identified different goals and the problems and the constraints. Now you want to organize this knowledge, and this organization is important because you want to identify that who are the people who I am going to talk to. So what you do is you do stakeholder identification, you do the prioritization of different goals that you have identified, and you try to filter the domain knowledge. And on the basis of that, you go into the final stage, which is of collecting requirements. Now, from the stakeholders that you have identified, what you would do, you will start asking them, by deploying different techniques that we have covered, for example, the interviews, questionnaires, focus group, brainstorming, and any of those techniques, you will go and talk to those stakeholders, and you'll start eliciting requirements. And not only the stakeholder requirements, but you will also try to gather the domain requirements. And you will also look at the organizational requirement, that does organization have any policies, any procedures, any safety standards, any security standards, any reliability standards, any documentation standards. You will also try to get hold of them. So elicitation process is a staged process. which is you cannot straight away jump into asking questions from different stakeholders, because this would not be a good idea. So first you need to identify goals, you need to understand the problem area, then you need to identify stakeholders, then you talk to different stakeholders. So it's a stepwise process, the requirement elicitation process. So then there were a few more things that we discussed in this series of lectures on requirement elicitation. We talked about stakeholder analysis. So we talked about stakeholder analysis, and in that we said that what is meant by this stakeholder analysis. Then it has multiple things. Number one, it involves identifying stakeholders, which is I think pretty obvious. The second thing it involves is understanding the attitudes, and how to satisfy different people is also very important, because when we need to talk to those people, then we need to know that how this guy is going to respond to me. And as you guys would have seen that those different state-of-the-art techniques that we have discussed in today's lectures, they all are targeting more end user involvement, or all of these they want that more stakeholders give you input about the new system, or help you in eliciting these requirements. So stakeholder analysis is really important, and so it not only involves identifying different people, it also involves identifying their attitudes, or how to deal with the particular guy, and breaking the ice is very important. How do you get this guy, talking with you? So this is very important. So the first thing that we covered after the stakeholder analysis was elicitation techniques, and then there are various elicitation techniques that we have covered. We started off with interviews, and we said that there are certain do's and don'ts in interviews, and you should be careful when you are preparing an interview. You should be careful what kind of question you should have, and it depends on what kind of interview you are having. Maybe in the beginning you can have very open-ended questions, because I said that elicitation process is a stepwise thing, and even those interviews that you conduct, you might have multiple interview sessions with one stakeholder. So maybe the first interview is very generic, where you have open-ended questions, where you're just trying to know the person, and you're trying to know what are the problems being faced by this guy, and what according to him is the best solution for him. And then you go home, and then you basically document this whole interview, and you identify the things which according to you are the requirements mentioned by this client, and then you go back and you maybe prepare a closed ended questions in that interview, and then you ask those questions for which you get very concrete answers. So and we also discussed an interview template, that how you basically start stakeholder talking. You basically ask you should ask very context-free questions in the beginning. So preparation of an interview is key, and deciding what kind of questions you should be putting in there and what kind of language you should be using in an interview is very, very important. The next technique that we covered was scenarios, and we said that scenario is how a certain person is interacting with the system, and if you guys are familiar with object-oriented design, then use cases is very close to scenario. And we looked at one of the techniques today as well, which was converting those user stories into scenarios, and then converting those scenarios into use cases. And as we discussed that multiple use cases can represent a scenario, or each use case is a scenario. There are different interpretations found in literature, but scenarios are very helpful, because they actually tell you how an end user would be doing a certain process. And we discussed different examples. For example, we discussed an example of library cataloging system, where you are trying to purchase a new document. So the first thing that you would do in this scenario is you submit your login information. Then you will try to find that particular document that you want to purchase, and then you will give your payment information, and then you will finally get that document. And there were few things that we discussed about scenarios, that in a scenario there would always be an initial state of the system, and when the scenario finishes there would be a final state of the system. There would be something changed in the system. Then we will have normal flow of events which would be involved in a scenario, and we might have exceptions related to each of those events. So that was our discussion on scenarios, and scenarios are a very useful way of eliciting requirements. And another technique that we have talked today about visually specifying requirement by Rashid et al. It also suggests that visual representation is a very convenient way of expressing requirements by the end users. So maybe scenarios if scenarios are incorporated in their day-to-day processes, and they know how to draw scenarios, then it might be very convenient for people to suggest or tell you different requirements. Then another thing we discussed in elicitation techniques is requirements reuse. We said that requirements, they can be reused, but there is no formal way of reusing requirements. It is done informally, but there is no formal technique which says, okay, if these are the requirements, how we can reuse them. But we know that in what scenarios we can reuse requirements. For example, if we are doing a problem which is of similar application domain, then we can reuse requirements. If we are doing a similar project for a similar organization and they have certain standards, we already have those requirements, we can reuse them, we don't need to elicit them again. So requirement reuse, it saves time, it saves cost as well, but again, as I said, there is no formal way of doing of reusing requirements. Another technique that we discussed was observation and social analysis, and we said that this is very important because at times people are so busy. For example, the key stakeholder, as I said, at times they're so busy in solving problems that they don't have time to for a separate interview session or for a focus group session. So what you would do, you would become an ethnographer and you would start observing that guy. So you would follow him, you will shadow him throughout the day and see what he is doing, how he deals with different people, how he solves different problems, how he uses the current system, and you will take notes. And towards the end of the day, you would try to do an analysis on them, and you will make your own representation of the process. And then you're going to share this with the people who are outside this process to get their feedback on it as well. And then after that, we discussed what is prototyping and how prototyping is useful in eliciting requirements. And we discussed that there are mainly two kinds of prototypes. One is a throwaway prototype and the other one is an executable prototype, and both of them, they serve different purposes. Why prototyping is very useful? Prototyping is useful because the end user, they get something to play with. And when they are using something, it enables them to express, what they want more clearly, because they can, when they can see a solution, then they can identify problems in it. So prototyping is very useful, and as I said, there are two different kinds of prototype, and both of them, they serve different purposes. The throwaway prototype is only done for those requirements for which you do not have a clear understanding. So because you want to gain that clear understanding, so you make a prototype. And that's why it's called a throwaway prototype, because you will just gather some initial requirements and you will skip design, and based on whatever you have gathered, you make a quick prototype and take it back to the client and resolve those conflicts that you had, or resolve those problems that you might have in understanding this particular scenario. And the executable prototype is done only for those requirements which are very clear. For example, you have elicited 10 different requirements, and from those 10 requirements, 4 of them are really clear, and there is no problem in them, and this is the way they are going to be done in the final product. So what you do is you make an executable prototype and you show it to the client, and you start building on that. So there are different, and we also recognize that there are different techniques for prototyping as well. Then we move to the questionnaires. And as I said, that there are two kinds of questionnaires that can be used. One are to build an opinion. So you do conduct a survey to build an opinion, and the second one is you want to test your assumption. You want to test your hypothesis about a certain situation. And again, different kind of questionnaires serve different purposes. So for example, as I said, that one very interesting technique can be that you prepare a survey or you prepare a questionnaire and you float it around in the organization before you are actually going for deploying any other elicitation technique. You just get a feel that what do the end users think about the current system, what are the problems in the current system, and how do they think they are would be the better solutions to their problems. So this questionnaire would kind of help you in gaining an understanding about the application domain, the background. It can also help you in identifying different stakeholders. So questionnaires are very interesting. The problem though with questionnaires is that their validity is always questioned, because you cannot be sure that the person whom you gave the questionnaire, he's actually the one who actually filled the questionnaire. So they are a very useful technique if done correctly, and if this validity question mark is not over them, then questionnaire is a very useful technique. It can be deployed in very interesting fashion to gain some very interesting insights. Then the next technique that we discussed is brainstorming, which as I said, it's a session where you basically have different stakeholders and you ask them to think about a problem and share what they think is a good solution. And as I said that normally brainstorming is done for those kind of problems which you have never thought about, that what would be a solution to them. So you do not know, and the stakeholders, they are not also sure. So you ask them, okay, let's sit together and discuss this problem. And then different people would share their ideas that, okay, this is how it can be resolved. And during our discussion on brainstorming, we discussed this example that, you want to automate the student attendance. You won't want the queues outside the class. You don't want to waste the lecture time. So how would you do it? So you ask different faculty members, students to sit together and say, okay, what do you think is a good solution? And then your different people came up with different ideas, and you record those ideas. And towards the end of the session, you prioritize some ideas and do further elicitation on those better ideas that you have summarized at the end of the session. Then another technique which was focus groups, which is very similar to brainstorming, but we said it is more formal, and it is normally an agenda based, and you will ask different stakeholders, and those stakeholders group, what they would do, they would identify their problems, they would identify their solutions, they would give rationale to their solutions as well. But as a facilitator, what you should do is you should finalize this session in such a fashion that those stakeholders group, they feel that they are taking something back from this session. And then very generic technique, which is actually a parent technique of all these brainstorming focus group, is collaborative requirement gathering. And we have seen some of the state-of-the-art techniques that we have discussed today, that they also kind of collaborative requirement gathering, but they provide a virtual environment for collaborative requirement gathering. For example, the web tool, the Wikibased tool, it's kind of collaborative requirement gathering, but because we have enabled it on the web, then different people are sitting in different locations, they can collaborate, and they already have a recording mechanism, which is the blog or the web page where they are saving that information. So collaborative requirement gathering has certain advantages, because it's an ideal way to resolve conflicts, because different people sit together, they share their problems, and they give their priorities, they identify their needs. If there are any inconsistencies in any conflicts, then you can resolve them as an analyst on the spot. Then another technique that we discussed is quality function deployment, and we said how it can be used to prioritize different requirements, prioritize different technical features, identify conflicts in them, and how it can be used to resolve those conflicts. And as I said, one thing that a couple of things that we should remember, that all these elicitation techniques, all of them, when they are used together, then their usefulness actually increases. So for example, questionnaires before interviews or before focus groups, they're going to increase the effectiveness of interviews. Okay, so these are not mutually exclusive, and we have seen in those different research articles that we discussed today as well, that they use a combination of different elicitation techniques. For example, one of the techniques, it uses scenarios and focus groups all in one. So you can think of different solutions where you can combine those different elicitation techniques and make this whole elicitation process more effective. A couple of other things that we discussed in elicitation process, which are part of our elicitation process, are analysis and negotiation, because we said that when we are eliciting requirements, we also identify lots of problematical requirements, and so we need to do some checking of those requirements. We need to identify what are those problematical requirements, and those problematical requirements might include some inconsistent requirements, some unnecessary requirements, or some incomplete requirements. So what do we do is that let's say we have identified 100 requirements. Out of those 100 requirements, there are 40 requirements which are problematical. That's a huge number. 40% of the requirements, they are problematical. Now what you do as a requirement analyst is that you identify them during this analysis phase, you prioritize them, that which are the high priority issues which I need to resolve. You take those issues back to the client, and you negotiate with the stakeholders. Okay, and we said that negotiation is also a staged activity. So first is that as a requirement analyst, you inform that different stakeholders that according to me, this is the problem with this particular requirement, and then you have a discussion where different stakeholders, they comment about it, and they try to explain that why do they think that this thing should be done in this particular fashion, and so they tell about their priorities and their needs. And then finally is the resolution stage, where you try to resolve that conflict. And we said that resolution can be there can be three possible things that you can do when you're resolving those conflicts in negotiation. You can either delete that requirement, okay, you can modify that requirement and satisfy everybody, and the third thing is that there is no resolution can be achieved. So what you do is you say, okay, we are going to look into this problem more deeply. So you will do further elicitation. But the goal in negotiation is that you want to satisfy all the clients. So that is it from our discussion on the elicitation process. So do remember that when in order to conduct an effective elicitation in order to have a very effective elicitation process, you need to do very careful stakeholder analysis. Then you need to also identify what combination of techniques you can deploy to elicit requirements in a better fashion. And the elicitation techniques, they are the same. You can build on those techniques and come up with more sophisticated methods of eliciting requirements. But the conflicts are inevitable, because when you are going to talk to so many people, then people are going to suggest things which are conflicting with each other. So you need mechanism to resolve that, and for that you do analysis. But towards the end, whatever requirements you get out of this elicitation process, each stakeholder should be satisfied with those requirements. So you do negotiation and you try to satisfy all the key people who are part of this process. So that is it from today's lecture, and inshallah in the next lecture we are going to start talking about requirements elaboration, and how do we elaborate on the requirements that we have elicited, how we do further analysis on them. So take care, and Allah Hafiz.